The whole town watched her walk up to him, and nobody said a word. It was a Friday afternoon in Pine Creek, Colorado, the kind of afternoon where the sun sat heavy and the dust didn't move. Most people were going about their business, or pretending to. Men stood outside the feed store, arms folded. Women slowed down near the general goods window. Children pressed against the barbershop glass. Everyone was watching, but nobody wanted to look like they were watching. Because the man she was walking toward was Henry Dalton. And people in Pine Creek did not walk toward Henry Dalton, not on purpose, not without a very good reason. She was a stranger. Nobody had seen her before that day. She had a worn carpetbag in one hand, dust on her boots, and a look on her face that said she had already thought this through. Her name was Millie Wembley, though the town wouldn't learn that until later. What they saw right now was a woman walking straight toward the most feared man in Pine Creek, and she wasn't slowing down. Henry sat on the bench outside the land office, alone, the way he always was. He was a large man with a black hat pulled low and a sun-faded shirt that had once been dark blue. His boots were cracked at the toe. His jaw was tight. He didn't look up as she approached. He just sat there, still and quiet, staring at the ground in front of him. She stopped 2 feet away and spoke clearly, without shaking. "I'd like to marry you." Nobody breathed. Henry looked up slowly. His eyes were gray and steady. He looked at the bag in her hand. He looked at the hem of her skirt, worn thin at the edges. He looked at her face. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She just stood there and waited. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that most people assumed he would stand up and walk away without a word, the way he did with most things that didn't concern him. But he didn't walk away. He looked at her one more time, steady, unhurried, and said 3 words. "When is it?" That was it. No questions, no argument, no laughter. Just 3 words that told her, and everyone on that street, that Henry Dalton had said yes. The town didn't know what to do with that. Here was a woman nobody knew, who had arrived that same day with nothing but a bag and a question. And here was Henry Dalton, a man people crossed the street to avoid, answering that question like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Nobody could figure out who was more surprising, the woman brave enough to ask, or the man willing to answer. Before we go any further, if this story already has your attention, don't just watch it. Be part of it. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now let's get back to Pine Creek, because what happens next, you won't see it coming. Millie Wembley had not always been the kind of woman who proposed to strangers. 3 months before she walked up to Henry Dalton, she had a home. It wasn't much, a 2-room house on the edge of Gable Falls, a small town 2 days' ride east of Pine Creek. She had a job at the laundry, a cot she paid for weekly, and a plan. The plan was simple. Save enough to rent a small plot of land, grow what she could, and ask no one for anything. She had been doing it alone since she was 19, and she was good at it. Not comfortable, but steady. And for a woman with no family and no one to fall back on, steady was enough. Then the laundry burned down. It happened on a Tuesday night in late March. Nobody was hurt, but the building was gone by morning. The owner, a man named Cossette, collected his insurance money and left Gable Falls within the week. He didn't say goodbye to his workers. He didn't pay out what he owed them either. Millie was left with $4, a carpetbag, and a cot she could no longer afford. She tried to find work in Gable Falls, but the town was small and the options were few. The saloon had openings, but Millie had seen what that life did to women, and she wasn't willing to go down that road. A farmer on the north end offered her room and board in exchange for work. But the way he looked at her, when he said it, told her everything she needed to know about that offer too. So she left. She spent 6 weeks moving between towns, Redstone, Calloway Bend, a nameless settlement that didn't even have a proper sign. She worked where she could. Washed dishes, mended clothes, helped a widow named Ora pack up her house when Ora's son came to take her north. Every town she stopped in, she asked about work. Every town gave her the same answer. Nothing steady, nothing safe. Nothing that didn't come with conditions she wasn't willing to meet. It was Ora, before she left, who mentioned Pine Creek. She said there was land there, a man named Dalton who owned more of it than he could work. She said he lived alone, kept to himself, and that the town gave him a wide berth. She didn't say why. She just said his name, and then went quiet, the way people do when they've said enough. Millie had thought about it for 2 weeks before she acted. She wasn't a reckless woman. She didn't make decisions without turning them over first. But she was also out of time and nearly out of money. She had exactly $1.60 when she stepped off the stage in Pine Creek. She had no contacts, no references, and no plan except the one she had built in her head on the long ride over. Find Henry Dalton. Make him a practical offer. Give him something useful in return for safety and shelter. What she hadn't accounted for was how fast he would say yes. That evening, after the street had emptied, and the town had gone back to pretending nothing had happened, Millie sat on the steps of the Pine Creek boarding house, the same steps where the landlady had told her she could stay one night, no more, until arrangements were made. She set her carpetbag on her knees and looked out at the empty street. She had done it. She had asked. He had answered. She told herself she felt relieved, and she did, mostly. But there was something else sitting underneath the relief, something quieter, a question she hadn't let herself ask yet. Why had he said yes so fast? Millie was awake before the rooster. She lay on the narrow cot in Mrs. Holt's boarding house, staring at the ceiling, turning the previous day over in her mind the way a person turns a stone, looking for cracks. The wedding was set for Saturday. 3 days. Henry had told her that right after she asked, then stood up, nodded once, and walked back toward his property at the east end of town without another word. No questions, no conditions, just the nod and the walk. At breakfast, a salesman named Pell smiled too wide and said he'd heard about her conversation with Dalton. Millie picked up her fork and said she supposed most of Pine Creek had. He laughed. She didn't. She had not come this far to be someone's punchline. After breakfast, she walked to the property. If she was going to live somewhere, and she needed to see it first. That was not boldness. That was just sense. The house was small but solid. Gray timber, a covered porch, a water pump near the side door. The vegetable patch on the east side had been abandoned for at least a season. Weeds in every row, soil cracked and pale. Henry was at the fence line when she arrived, repairing a broken rail. He turned when he heard her boots, looked at her a moment, then kept working. She told him the garden needed work. He said he knew. She said she could fix that. He looked at her, steady, unhurried, and said all right. That was the whole conversation. But as she walked back toward town, something sat in the back of her mind that she hadn't expected. Not relief. Not satisfaction. A question. One she hadn't thought to ask before. The whole town feared Henry Dalton, but not one person had told her why. Nobody in Pine Creek talked about Henry Dalton directly. They talked around him, the way you talk around a fire that's still hot. You don't put your hand near it. You just acknowledge it's there and give it space. Millie had picked up pieces over 3 days without asking a single direct question. A word here from Mrs. Holt, a pause there from the woman at the dry goods counter. The way men at the feed store went quiet when his name came up, then found something else to look at. What she had gathered was this. Henry had come to Pine Creek 7 years ago, alone, with enough money to buy land and enough silence to make people uncomfortable. He had never explained where he came from. He had never sought friends. And once, about 4 years back, A man had come to his property looking for trouble and left Pine Creek the next morning without it. Nobody said what happened between those 2 points. Nobody needed to. What Millie did not know, what nobody in Pine Creek knew in full, was the weight Henry Dalton carried under that silence. He had grown up in a town called Harlan Bluff, 2 states east, in a house where his mother, a quiet woman named Cora, had made one terrible mistake in her youth, a mistake that attached her to a man named Briggs. Briggs was not violent in the obvious way. He was patient. He collected debts the way some men collect land, slowly, without hurry, certain the day would come when he could call it in. Cora had spent 20 years trying to put distance between herself and that debt. She died before she managed it. And Briggs, the kind of man who treats a dead woman's son as an extension of what he's owed, had never stopped looking. Henry had known, every year since he left Harlan Bluff, that distance was not the same as done. He had chosen Pine Creek because it was remote and unremarkable. He had chosen silence because noise drew attention. And he had said yes to Millie Wembley on a Friday afternoon, not just because the arrangement was practical, but because a man who knows a storm is coming builds something solid before it arrives. They had been married 4 days when it happened. Not an argument. Nothing that dramatic. Just the first moment the careful distance between them cracked open enough to let something real through. It was evening. Millie had spent the day pulling weeds from the garden patch, resetting the rows, working the dry soil until her hands were raw. She had not asked Henry for help, and he had not offered it. That was the arrangement, each doing what needed doing, no commentary required. But when she came inside and found a tin basin of warm water sitting on the kitchen table, without a word, without him anywhere in sight, she stood there looking at it for a long moment. It was a small thing, the kind of thing a person does when they have been watching without appearing to watch. She sat down, put her hands in the water, and did not say anything. But something shifted, something quiet, and without a name. Henry came in from the barn an hour later and found her still at the table, reading a 3-week-old newspaper she'd found on the shelf. He sat across from her and poured himself a coffee. They sat in silence for a while, the comfortable kind, not the tense kind. And then Millie set the paper down and asked him, straight and without softening it, "Is there something coming that I should know about?" Henry looked at her over his cup. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he set the cup down, folded his hands on the table, and told her about Briggs. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. A man from his past. A debt that wasn't his but carried his name. The reason he had built his life so far from where it started. He spoke in plain sentences without self-pity. Millie listened without interrupting. When he finished, the room was quiet again. She looked at the table for a moment, then looked at him. "All right," she said. The same word he had used about the garden, and he understood exactly what she meant by it. "Not all right. That's fine. But all right. Now I know, and knowing changes things." That night, for the first time since she had arrived in Pine Creek, Millie Wembley did not lie awake asking questions. She already had the one answer that mattered. Whatever was coming, it was coming for both of them now. He rode into Pine Creek on a Tuesday, and the town felt it before it saw him. That was the only way to describe it. Horses shifted at the hitching posts. Conversations shortened. Children were called inside earlier than usual. Briggs wasn't a large man. That was the first thing people noticed. He was lean and weathered, with pale eyes, and a gray coat that had seen too many roads. He moved through town slowly, the way a man moves when he is certain the town will wait for him. He stopped at the saloon, had a drink, asked the barman a question that the barman later refused to repeat, and then rode out toward the east end of town, toward Henry's property. Mrs. Holt saw him pass her window and went straight to the back room and did not come out for an hour. She had never seen the man before in her life. She couldn't have explained why he frightened her. Some people carry their damage on the outside. Briggs carried his on the inside, and it pressed against his skin like something trying to get out. Henry saw the dust on the road before he saw the rider. He was on the porch when Briggs pulled up to the fence line and stopped. Millie was inside. Henry stayed where he was, standing, not moving, the one hand resting near his hip, with the kind of stillness that is not calm, but is the thing that lives just before calm ends. Briggs looked at him across the fence and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who has rehearsed this moment. He said Henry's name. He said he had been looking for him for a long time. He said something about Cora, Henry's mother, and the word debt, and the word due. He said it all pleasantly, the way a man discusses the weather when he wants you to know the weather is not what he is actually discussing. Henry did not respond. He just watched. Then the front door opened behind him, and Millie stepped onto the porch and stood beside her husband, arms at her sides, looking at Briggs the way she had looked at everything since she arrived in Pine Creek, directly, without flinching. Briggs looked at her. Something moved behind his pale eyes. He had not expected a woman. He had not expected witnesses. He had not expected Henry Dalton to look like a man with something worth protecting. He tipped his hat. He said he would be in town a few days. He said they would talk again soon. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward Pine Creek without hurrying. Henry stood very still until the dust settled. Millie stood beside him and said nothing, but her shoulder was 1 inch from his, and neither of them moved away. 3 days passed, and Briggs did not come back to the property. He stayed in town, eating at the saloon, sitting outside the feed store, talking to anyone who would talk to him. That was the thing about Briggs. He didn't hide. He wanted to be seen. He wanted Henry to know exactly where he was and exactly how long he was willing to wait. It was a pressure technique, slow and deliberate, like water finding a crack. Pine Creek didn't know what to make of him. He was polite enough on the surface. He tipped his hat to women. He paid for his drinks. But the town felt the wrongness of him the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Men stopped lingering outside the saloon. Women took different routes to the market. The barman told his wife that night that the man's eyes never matched what his mouth was doing. And his wife told him she had noticed that too, and neither of them slept well. Henry knew what Briggs wanted. He had always known. The debt Briggs claimed went back to a transaction his mother had made before Henry was old enough to understand what was happening. Land signed over under pressure. A signature extracted from a woman who had no real choice. It wasn't legal. It had never been legal. But Briggs didn't operate in the territory of legal. He operated in the territory of fear, and for most of Henry's life, that had been enough. Henry had run once at 18, because running had seemed like the only option. He had spent 7 years in Pine Creek building something solid and quiet and his own, and he had told himself that distance was protection enough. Millie had changed that calculation without meaning to, not because she had done anything dramatic, but because the morning after Briggs rode up to the fence line, Henry had watched her go out to the garden at dawn, moving through the rows she had rebuilt with her own hands, unhurried, unbothered, already planning the next season. And something inside him had locked into place. He was not going to run again. He was not going to let Briggs take one more thing from him. And he was not going to let this woman, who had asked nothing of him except steadiness, inherit a debt that was never his to begin with. That evening he rode into Pine Creek and found the town's one lawyer, an older man named Carver, who worked out of a back room behind the notary office. Henry sat down across from him and laid out what he knew: the original transaction, the dates, his mother's name, the circumstances. Carver listened without interrupting. When Henry finished, Carver was quiet for a moment. Then he said there might be something to work with. He said it carefully, the way careful men say things they aren't certain of yet. But Henry rode home that night with something he hadn't carried in a long time. Not hope, exactly, but the feeling that comes just before hope, When a person stops waiting for things to happen to them and starts deciding what happens next. Briggs came back on Thursday. This time, he didn't stop at the fence line. He rode straight up to the porch, like a man who had decided that politeness had served its purpose, and it was time to move on to the next thing. He had 2 men with him. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. They were the kind of men who exist to make a point without speaking. Henry was in the barn when he heard the horses. He came out with a hand on the barn door and nothing in his face. Millie was at the garden, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up. She stood when she heard the hooves, brushed the soil from her hands, and walked toward the porch with the same unhurried step she had used the first day she walked toward Henry on that bench. Briggs watched her come and smiled his rehearsed smile. He said he had come to discuss the terms of the debt. He said he was a reasonable man and had always been willing to negotiate. He looked at the house, at the barn, at the land stretching east, and the look on his face made clear exactly what kind of negotiation he had in mind. The land, all of it, in exchange for walking away. Henry came to stand beside Millie. Neither of them spoke yet, so they just stood together on that porch and looked at Briggs the way 2 people look at a problem they have already solved in private. It was Millie who spoke first. Her voice was level and clear and carried across the yard without effort. She told Briggs she had spent the last 2 days in town. She told him she had visited the land office, where the deed to this property was registered in both names now, hers and Henry's, filed the morning after Briggs's first visit. She told him she had also paid a visit to the county sheriff in Delmore, a man named Hatch, and left a written account of the debt's history, Briggs's arrival, and the names of 3 Pine Creek residents who had witnessed his first visit to the property. She told him that Sheriff Hatch was expecting a follow-up letter by the end of the week, and that if that letter did not arrive, he had instructions to ride out himself. Briggs's smile did not disappear all at once. It faded the way light fades, slowly, then completely. One of the men behind him shifted in his saddle. The other looked at the ground. Briggs looked at Millie for a long moment with those pale eyes, recalculating again. Only this time there was nothing left to recalculate. She had closed every door before he arrived. He looked at Henry. Henry looked back at him with 15 years of patience and said just 4 words, quiet and final. "You should ride on." Briggs sat there 1 moment longer, the last moment of a man deciding whether his pride is worth more than his freedom. Then he turned his horse. His 2 men followed. The dust came up and settled, and they were gone. Henry stood very still. Millie stood beside him. Then she went back to the garden and picked up where she left off. 3 months passed, then 6. Then a full year turned over quietly the way years do in small towns, marked not by single events, but by small accumulations. The garden came back. Millie had known it would. She had worked that soil every morning through spring and into summer, resetting the rows, coaxing water from the pump, pulling weeds before they had a chance to settle. By July there were tomatoes. By August there were beans and squash, and a row of sunflowers along the east fence that nobody had planted on purpose. But that came up anyway, tall and unhurried, like they had always meant to be there. Henry watched all of it without comment, but he built a second raised bed on the south side of the house without being asked. He did it on a Saturday while Millie was in town. She came home and stood looking at it for a long moment, and then went inside and made dinner. That was the rhythm of them, noticing without announcing, doing without explaining. A language built entirely from action, and understood completely by both. What neither of them said out loud, what neither of them had words for yet, was that the arrangement had become something else entirely. It had happened the way the garden happened, not in one moment, but in many small ones, layered over time until the original thing was unrecognizable. It was in the way Henry always left the lamp on when he came in late, so she wouldn't wake to a dark house. The way Millie kept his coffee hot without being asked. The way they had started sitting on the porch in the evenings, not because there was anything to discuss, but because the silence was better shared. And then one evening in October, Millie told him she was expecting. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. No ceremony, no softening. Just the fact, set on the table between them like something solid. Henry was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her, not with the steady measuring look she had come to know so well, but with something underneath it. Something that had been waiting a long time to surface. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Outside, the sunflowers had gone to seed, and the first cold was coming down from the mountains, and Pine Creek was settling into autumn the way it always did. Slowly, without fuss. But inside that small gray house at the end of the dirt road, something had just cracked open that no winter could touch. It was not the life either of them had planned. It was not built on declarations or grand gestures or the kinds of things people in Pine Creek would have recognized as love. It was built on warm water left in a basin, on coffee poured without asking, on a man who fixed fences and a woman who fixed soil, and two people who had chosen, quietly and without performance, to keep choosing each other. And now, there would be three of them. Henry looked at his hand over hers, and for the first time in 15 years, maybe longer, felt something loosen in his chest. Like a knot he had forgotten was there finally letting go. The baby came in April, just as the ground was softening and the first green was pushing through the garden rows. They named her Cora, Henry's choice, offered quietly one evening on the porch, and accepted by Millie without hesitation. It was the right name. Not a grand gesture, just a small, deliberate act of honoring the woman whose suffering had set everything in motion. The debt, the running, the bench outside the land office on a Friday afternoon in Pine Creek. Cora Dalton arrived just before dawn, small and loud and certain, and Henry held her with the careful stillness of a man who has spent his whole life being gentle with things that could break. He did not look like the man Pine Creek feared that morning. He looked like what he had always been underneath the silence and the black hat and the cracked boots. A man who had simply been waiting for something worth being careful with. Millie watched him from the bed and felt something settle in her so completely and finely that she understood, for the first time, what the word home had always meant. Not a place, a state of being, the condition of having somewhere that holds you. Pine Creek talked, of course. They always had, and they always would. Some said Millie Wembley had been the bravest woman to set foot in that town in 20 years. Some said she had been reckless and lucky in equal measure. So a few, the ones who had watched Henry Dalton walk these streets for 7 years and never once seen his face change, said they had never understood him until they saw him carry that baby across the porch on an April morning and stand in the early light looking out at the garden and the fence and the property he had built from distance and discipline and an 18-year-old boy's decision to survive. Mrs. Holt said nothing at all, which for her was the loudest possible endorsement. The salesman Pell had long since moved on to the next town. The lean fence post at the end of the dirt road had been replaced. Solid and straight now. Set deep. The garden was full. The second raised bed Henry had built without being asked was planted with winter squash and would be ready by fall. Briggs never came back, and Sheriff Hatch's letter had been enough. Some debts, when faced plainly and without flinching, simply lose their power. That was what Millie had understood from the beginning, that most things people fear are counting on you to look away. She never had. Not once in her life. And so here she was, alive and whole in a small gray house at the end of a dirt road in Pine Creek, Colorado, with a husband who left warm water in a basin and a daughter named for a woman she never met, and a garden that came back every year without being told to. She had arrived with $1.60 and a plan built in her head on a long stage ride. The plan had changed. Everything else had turned out better than she had any right to expect. And that's the story of Millie Wembley and Henry Dalton, two people who had nothing and chose each other anyway, not out of love at first, out of something quieter and maybe more enduring, the willingness to stay, to show up, to keep choosing, one small act at a time, until the choosing became something neither of them could imagine undoing. If this story moved you, you already know what that feeling is. It's the same thing Millie felt on that porch in April, watching Henry hold their daughter in the early light. It's the recognition that the best things in life rarely announce themselves. They just show up, plain and steady, and wait to see if you're brave enough to say yes. If you made it to the end of this one, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know. And if you want another story like this one, the next one is already waiting for you on screen right now. Go ahead and click it. I'll see you there.